And when he introduced himself and said that he'd like to help me delve into God's Word to dig out all the answers to my tough questions, he said, I'll make a deal with you. As long as your mother provides a lot of RC Cola and her famous bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches, I'll come over every Thursday night. And I'll go through the Bible with you, and we'll tackle some of your questions. Well, I don't think he knew what he was getting in for, because that first Thursday night when he sat down in front of me with his open Bible, the first thing I said to him was, you tell me, how can this be God's will? I don't get it. I don't understand how this can be the will of God. I was throwing a lot at him, but immediately I was surprised. This young man, Steve, countered with a question for me. And he said, well, Johnny, do you think it was God's will that Jesus suffered the way he did? I mean, do you think that the cross was God's will? Hello? What a stupid question. I mean, I went to Sunday school. Of course that's God's will. Yes, that's God's will. Anybody knows that. Well, Steve flipped to John chapter 13, and he read there how Satan entered the heart of Judas Iscariot, who handed over Jesus for a mere 30 pieces of silver. Clearly, it was the devil who played a leading role in instigating the whole thing of the crucifixion, because no doubt it was Satan-sponsored pride that entered the heart of Pontius Pilate to hand down mock justice in order to gain political popularity. And then he said, what about that mob in the streets clamoring for Christ's crucifixion? Crucify him, they screamed. You better believe the devil was egging them on. And what about those drunken soldiers? All you got to do is flip through any one of the Gospels, spitting on Jesus, mocking him, slapping him, beating him with a rod, punching him in the groin, you name it, pulling out his beard. How could any of that be God's will? Treason, injustice, torture, murder. I didn't have an answer for that. And that's when Steve flipped over to the New Testament in Acts chapter 4, verse 28. And he said, Johnny, I want you to look and see how the early Christians who had God's perspective viewed it all. For it says there that they praised God that, get this, the men responsible for Jesus' death, Pilate, the mob in the streets, the drunken soldiers, these men did, it says, what God's will and power had decided beforehand should happen. Now, God did not make these men sin and scheme. No, that stuff was already in their evil hearts. All God did was inasmuch say, okay, you want to scheme up trouble? I'll let you do it, but when you do it, I'm going to make certain that you do it in such a way that it serves my ends and accomplishes my purposes. And so Satan ended up slitting his own throat when he inspired the crucifixion. Because the world's worst murder becomes the world's only salvation. You see, God is not only not frustrated, and not only is he not hindered by Satan's schemes, but he actually aborts them. He's like, he does this judo. I think it was Dorothy Sayers who said, God reaches down into what otherwise looks like awful evil and goes like, hi-ya, and wrenches out of it positive good for us and glory for himself. God will permit what he hates, my friend Steve told me. God will permit what he hates to accomplish and achieve that which he loves. And sometimes God and the devil may want the exact same thing to happen, but for different reasons. Satan's motive in the crucifixion was obvious. Stop this ridiculous talk about redemption. Stop God's Son dead in his tracks. But God's motive was through the crucifixion to open up the floodgates of heaven so that whosoever will might come in. God permitted what he hated a cruel cross in order to achieve that which he loved, our salvation. And that's when Steve said to me, Johnny, the same is true for you. If you can figure out at least some of the insights behind why God permitted his own son to suffer, they should suffice for you. Maybe Satan's motive for you in that accident was to shipwreck your faith, to turn you into an angry young woman who would defame the good name of God and smear his reputation. But no, God's motive was to turn you into a young woman whom by his grace would be pushed deep into the heart of God out of desperate need. And maybe God's motive is to turn you into a young woman who will reach other people with disabilities like yourself with his good news. So God permits what he hates, spinal cord injury, to accomplish that which he loves. My character refined and pured, and my life with a purpose. And then he added in a serious tone, and I'll never forget it. He said, Johnny, God's purpose in redeeming any one of us is not to make our lives happy and healthy and free of trouble. God's purpose in redeeming us is to make us more like Jesus. And sometimes that hurts. Little did I realize it then, but in a nutshell, Steve had given me probably the most important doctrine I'd ever learned, next to that of salvation. And that was the doctrine of his sovereignty. God is in control. You know, we just don't hear a lot about that nowadays. Christians need to grasp this critical insight from God's word, I'm convinced. And I'm also convinced perhaps that's why he tells us in Luke chapter 14 to go out and find people like me, quadriplegics, paraplegics, people with Down syndrome, people with spina bifida, people who are blind, deaf. Go out, he says in Luke 14, into the streets and the alleys and the highways and byways, find the disabled and bring them in so that you will be blessed and my Father's house will be full. It's one of the reasons we do what we do at Joni and Friends, because we know when God gathers people with disabilities into countless churches across the country, it showcases his sovereignty. And the church can't help but be blessed when it goes out and finds the disabled and brings them in. Do this, and you will be blessed. Yes, there really are no accidents in the Christian's life. Even spinal cord injury first must be screened by God's wise, provident hand. How else can the church be blessed? By somebody like me? By people with disabilities? Well, I think another powerful lesson is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 and 10. Let me read this for you, and let me give you the context. Paul is struggling, the apostle is struggling with his own weakness. Most believe that it was probably a physical disability. But God answers him when Paul requests to be healed. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And that's when Paul was able to say, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults and hardships and persecutions and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I tell you what, God's heart is always, always, always toward those who recognize that we're all richer when we recognize our poverty, when we admit it. We're all stronger when we acknowledge our limitations. And that we're all wiser when we count the world's wisdom as foolishness. And I think that's why God will use a person with a disability, especially if that person, let's say with multiple sclerosis, smiles. Not in spite of her problems, but by God's grace because of them.